Hello, BookTube. I come to you with yet another reading update. I'm going to talk about the recent book which I read, Lower Than the Angels: A History of Sex and Christianity by Dermot McCulloch, the famed and respected historian of Christianity, and quite possibly the leading expert on this subject alive today. And he has written a fascinating book all about the different ways in which the church's attitude towards sex and gender, and also marriage, has evolved over the centuries. I learned an enormous amount from this book, and it was also a tremendously enjoyable reading experience. McCulloch brings his usual gravitas, scholarly gravitas, and precision to the work, as well as his sharp wit, which just makes this a tremendously enjoyable, incredibly entertaining read, as well as being a work of great intellectual substance. Now, what I found so fascinating about this work is that, like his other books on Christianity, such as his book on the first 3,000 years of Christianity and his book on the Reformation, he doesn't treat these events or this religion as something that is set in stone, something which has always had a very fixed and familiar form. Instead, he is very good when it comes to writing about the contingency and talking about the fluid nature of the belief systems that he writes so much about. And you get a sense from his works of just how diverse Christianity was in terms of the various positions, the various uh, pronouncements, and um, authoritative statements of doctrine that have existed in this religion over the centuries. Now, when it comes to the whole topic, the whole thorny topic of sex and gender, Christianity has had an enormous amount to say over the past 2,000 years. And McCulloch goes into the whole gamut of opinion over many, many centuries within the Christian world about this whole issue of sex, of marriage, of gender relations, and the interplay between Christian thinking on these issues and the belief systems of the societies in which Christianity actually developed itself. In particular, the Greek and Roman traditions of sex and gender and how these played into Christianity, and of course the Jewish tradition on these issues, which obviously Christianity being an offshoot of Judaism heavily influenced early Christian thinking, especially. It was rather astounding to read in this book that until relatively recently in the Christian story, there was no such thing as a church marriage. Marriage was seen as something worldly, it was seen as something that was really a second best compared to celibacy. There is the famous quote from Paul of Tarsus, in which he says that it is better to marry than to burn. In other words, if one cannot control one's desire for sexual intercourse, then it's better to have that within the context of a marriage, which at least is recognized as a divine institution, as opposed to having sexual intercourse outside of marriage, which of course is taboo and has always been taboo within not just Christianity, but also its Jewish forerunner. So, if you get a sense from Saul of Tarsus, Saul/Paul, that the early Christians really saw sex of any kind, even marital sex, as being undesirable. And funnily enough, it was actually the case that even sex within marriage was seen as tainted with sin, to the point where loving your wife or your husband too much was seen as sinful in early Christianity. The advice that was given to married couples was that sex should be avoided as much as possible. And the best kind of marriage in early Christian tradition was a celibate marriage in which no sexual intercourse whatsoever took place. Now, this changed as time went on. There was a decisive shift around the time of the Reformation, where you had people such as Luther and Erasmus challenge this whole idea of celibacy somehow being a more blessed state than marriage. And you have the famous example of Luther famously rebelling against the Catholic Church and going as far as to marry a former nun, Katharina von Bora, who he went on to have children with. And this was the beginning of a very new tradition within Christianity, in which marriage was seen as being a positive thing and was seen as and was something that was celebrated and was promoted, and not simply seen as a begrudging concession to sin. It was seen as something that was divinely inspired, divinely ordained, divinely instituted, and something which was very much a force for good, provided, of course, that it was blessed by the church, provided, of course, that both parties were good Christians and that they were dedicated to bringing up their children in the right way, in the right Christian way, and living a life of holy matrimony. So that was very interesting to read about. McCulloch also talks a lot about the issue of celibacy within the clergy and how the church's position on that evolved. For the first several centuries of Christianity, married clergy were actually a thing. There was a big stigma attached to it, but most clergy were in fact married. And for many centuries, Christians couldn't really work out how to deal with this thorny issue of having clerics who were, on the one hand, supposed to represent this ideal of holiness, and yet on the other hand, were having marriages, which, as I've just said, were looked down upon in early Christian tradition, because even marriage was seen as something which was ultimately a product of the fall of Adam and Eve, and therefore to be avoided as much as possible. And of course, even when marriage was spoken positively of, it was in the sense that you had these two people who'd come together and agreed to live together as a celibate couple, but not having sexual intercourse, not partaking of the usual obligatory activities that would take place between man and wife in everyday life. And what really changed is the Gregorian Revolution, in which Pope Gregory instituted for the first time a ban on married clergy. And it took some time for this ban to be fully effected, but this is the revolution that instituted for all time the ideal of a celibate clergy. And this meant that there was a greater gulf than ever before between the laity and the clergy. And this is what has brought into being, what still exists today in the Catholic Church. You have this strict separation between the celibate priesthood and everyone else in the Catholic family. And the Gregorian Revolution was what really stamped that on Christianity permanently. That has been the case ever since. And despite some resistance, the 19th century, the popes of the 19th century, especially Pope Leo XIII, made it quite clear that there would be no backsliding from this principle. So that has remained with the Church, with the Catholic Church, ever since. Obviously, Protestantism went off in its own direction and very much celebrates marriage among the clergy, and very much sees this whole idea of clerical families as being a bulwark of Christianity, as being very much within God's plan, as being the sort of bedrock, if you will, of how a Christian society should be. And that is certainly the kind of family that I was brought up in, and which Dermot McCulloch, who is the son of a priest, an Anglican vicar, in fact, was also brought up in. So it's really interesting to see all these different traditions of Christianity on sex and gender. Another thing which McCulloch goes into great detail about is this whole thorny business of non-binary people, which, of course, contemporary Christians today are very hostile towards. But back in the days of early Christianity, there was this really strange phenomenon which happened among the ascetic communities, especially, in which you had these women, these holy women, who were so determined to reach the Christian ideal of holiness that they disguised themselves as men so that they could get away with all sorts of pious activities that they otherwise would not have been allowed to do. And interestingly enough, these individuals were revered, for the most part, by the early Christians. And it helped their case that in these times, the tradition very much was that a woman was an inferior version of a man. And therefore, the ideal, really, for a woman was to try as much as possible to be like a man and to redeem herself from her female nature. So that was what a lot of these female ascetics were trying to do when they disguised themselves as men. That was enormously entertaining to read about. Obviously, the contemporary church would regard such things as incredibly embarrassing, but it's really good for McCulloch to reveal this rather uncomfortable reality about the history and the tradition of this religion, a tradition that so many people who call themselves Christian probably know nothing about and would be deeply ashamed of if they knew about it. And I just love the way in which McCulloch writes about Christianity. I love the way in which he debunks these myths. I love how he blows out of the water this idea that there has always been one monolithic Christian tradition, when in fact there have been a multiplicity of traditions and viewpoints throughout history, not just on sex and gender, but on all sorts of things. And this is just another one of his masterpieces, the most recent one. I really enjoyed it. Every single chapter has something revelatory. It helps, of course, that McCulloch is a brilliant writer with a very naughty sense of humor. He never fails to poke fun at the superstition and the myths and the downright silliness of so much of early Christianity and what came after it. And it is just a cracking read. I heartily enjoyed every moment of this book. It isn't massive. It is about 500 pages. I read this in just under 2 weeks, I believe, or maybe even less than that. But let me see if there are some passages I could read out. Yes, this is a very juicy passage. This is about Martin Luther and the Lutheran attitude towards polygamy. This was very entertaining. In the same fashion, Protestants learned very quickly that any revisions of marriage and Christian family life in the name of faithfulness to Holy Scripture had serious limits. The most consequential road not taken was predictable, the option of polygamy. Luther was open to the possibility. As a good Scripture-alone man, aware of Old Testament precedent, he was prepared to say of polygamy that I cannot forbid it, nor is it opposed to the Holy Scriptures. Now that is definitely something that would make any good contemporary Christian jump with horror. After 1540, he and his colleagues in Wittenberg, Philip Melanchthon, Schwarzert, were badly affected by association with a marital scandal, together with the Strasbourg reformer Martin Bucer. They had secretly condoned a resort to bigamy by their important princely supporter in the empire, Landgraf Philip of Hessen, in his effort to resolve his marital difficulties. Melanchthon and Bucer were actually guests at the bigamous wedding. Now, that is one of the more scandalous episodes in Christian history for sure, and it is one which I am sure McCulloch greatly enjoyed writing about, because it flies in the face of so much of what has become accepted by contemporary Christians in terms of what the ideal marriage is. And the ideal of marriage in Christianity nowadays, and has been the case for many centuries, is monogamy, strict monogamy. You have one man and one wife. And yet, you have here an example of Christians many centuries ago challenging this idea and arguing, according to their Protestant Bible alone teaching, that actually perhaps polygamy wasn't prohibited. Perhaps God had no problem with it. And of course, no Lutheran today would want to own up to their forebears ever having believed this. But this was certainly a position which Martin Luther and many of his fellow Protestants took at one point, now as did quite a few Christians before them. Indeed, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has had a difficult time on its hands dealing with the fact that so many ordinary Ethiopians for so many centuries saw no problem with polygamy. And this is actually the case with Africa as a whole, and indeed large parts of the world outside of Europe, which had a tradition, a pre-Christian tradition of polygamy that Christian missionaries had to work very hard to fight against. And McCulloch goes into great detail about that in this book. This was a fantastic way to finish off my reading, my non-fiction reading for the month of December. This is actually a spillover from November, from non-fiction November, which I never got round to. So I have now finished that book, and I don't know what I will read next. I will have to decide sooner rather than later what book I want to read next, or what set of books I would like to read next to finish off my reading for this year. I will be going abroad very shortly to Vienna in Austria, where I will be spending the first few days of my Christmas holiday, and I may well take one or two books with me, most likely poetry. I find that poetry is what I like to read when I'm abroad, usually. I did actually take with me a copy of Bleak House when I went to the States in the summer, and it was a bleak reading experience. So I might just stick to poetry for the 3 days I'm in Vienna, because I don't think that 3 days, with all the stuff I will be doing in that rather hectic but short period of time, will be enough for me to squeeze in a novel of any kind. So it will most likely be a work of poetry that I take with me, and I will have to sort out my reading schedule for the rest of this year and figure out what books I have in mind to read. I still have the biography of Napoleon by what's his name? Adam Zamoyski to read, which I did not read in non-fiction November. So I will probably get to that at some point, but I may change my mind. I may decide to read something else. So I suppose this is what they call mood reading. I don't like the connotations of that term because it suggests that you are this rather fickle individual who can't stick with one book or one set of books for any length of time. Whereas I, of course, am very disciplined in that regard. Once I start a book, I generally finish it. So I don't like the connotations of the term mood reading, but I suppose that is essentially what I'm doing, is I'm deciding what to read next based on what I feel like. Which doesn't mean that if I decide I'm not enjoying it, I will simply drop it halfway through. Unless, of course, I'm really not liking it. I rarely do that. The last book I did that to was probably a work by Dickens, Martin Chuzzlewit, which I remember DNFing a while back. But generally I like to stick with my books. So if you have any recommendations for things you think I should be reading, feel free to comment below in the comment section below. Apologies for the delay between this video and the last video. I find that my schedule is increasingly hectic and increasingly busy, but I'm glad that I have found the time to squeeze in this video for you all. Only one book, unfortunately. Dermot McCulloch's works are always very meaty, and they deserve to be read in isolation, I find. But Dermot McCulloch's Lower Than the Angels, A History of Sex and Christianity, I heartily recommend. Goes all the way from early Christianity all the way to the present day as well. I find he's a bit less strong when it comes to talking about the history of Christianity in more modern times than he is in ancient times. I suppose that is to be expected. He is probably not an expert when it comes to modern history, since Christianity has, for most of its time in existence, not been a particularly modern faith. So that is Lower Than the Angels, A History of Sex and Christianity. It should be available at all good bookstores everywhere. Do get your copy. It's expensive, but it is worth every penny. Bye for now, BookTube.